I'm Grace Ho. I'm Deputy Director at India-China Institute. We gather here tonight, of course, to celebrate research and scholarship, especially among our student fellows. India-China Institute was established back in 2004. It's not last year, but last semester, we celebrated the 20th anniversary of India-China Institute. Since 2006, the fellowship came into full play, and the student fellowship started right around there. So for the past 19 years, believe it or not, we have supported well over 100 full-time students at the new school. Students come from all different departments. Some are undergraduate students, some are PhD students. India-China Institute, the fellowship, the India-China Institute Student Fellowship, it offers to all students, obviously. We're saying as long as you are a full-time student, whether it supports your exploratory trip to India, China, or some of the PhD students go there multiple times to deepen the research and understanding. We welcome that as well. So for you, students who are here to learn about this wonderful opportunity, we want you to know you could, today actually the 5 fellows, some of them, I think Patel was in India, Nolan was in China, and then Florian was in Thailand to look into the migrants or sojourners over there in South Asia. We have Arichika, who is a PhD student at public and urban policy at the New School for Social Research. She has not embarked on her field research yet, but she has done the preliminary research, etc. Emily was due to the topic, the sensitivity, etc., she has done her online research. So tonight, we really have a good opportunity to look at the whole spectrum of a research, beginning in the middle, finish, as well as completed the research. We are obviously using this opportunity as well to announce our 2025 to 2026 Student Star Foundation Star Student Award. The application is starting. The deadline is December the 15th. You could find our the Star Student Award 2026 right over there, where on India-China Institute's website, if you go to the right-hand side, the resources under fellowship, and then for students. You could read the student's report. Each student is required to present, to submit a report as well as do this presentation. The final reports can be found right over, it's a little bit buried over there, right there, under students, under here. If you wanted to learn what other students have done in the past. But also, students do research during the research. We ask our students to put up blogs, things that are of interest to you. It does not necessarily have to be your work, the research itself. It can be an interesting anecdote during the trip. It can be a tip of buying, a ticket, or your experience in the country, whether it's India, it's China. Occasionally, we have people to go to other countries beyond India and China. So you could find the student field research note right over there under the resource page. We welcome everyone to be here. Towards the end of this presentation, there are some Indian and Chinese samplers and food outside, where we also have the opportunity to interact with our student fellows as well as us, the India-China Institute's work team. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Professor Manjari Mahanjan, who is co-director of India-China Institute, and to introduce the fellows a bit more.
Thank you very much, Grace. As Grace said, I'm Manjari Mahajan. I teach in the International Affairs program at NSSR, and along with Mark Fraser, who's not here because he's on a sabbatical in Taiwan, I co-direct the India-China Institute. As you probably have gathered, ICI, the India-China Institute, is a hub for research and public engagement on India, China, but also more broadly Asia. We are in the middle of UN Week right now in New York, at a time when the UN seems to be in crisis. At this moment of unprecedented uncertainty, when the United States seems to be actively attacking long-established international institutions, it seems as though the kind of research and work we do at ICI is especially important and valuable. So we see our intellectual mandate as tracing, mapping, trying to understand new kinds of alliances, new kinds of geopolitical alignments, technological and infrastructural arrangements, new forms of digital governance that are emerging very often in the global south and very often as alternatives to older regimes. A lot of what we are seeing as emerging as alternative regimes is going to be shaped by foreign policies, economic policies in China, but also in India and other parts of Asia. So we see our mandate as really understanding these emerging orders or disorders, as it might be. Our work has different components. The most visible is public programming. The second component of our work is around research clusters. We have just published a new edited volume on politics of expertise in India and China. I just saw a colleague, we are trying to develop a new thematic on Asia, Africa interactions and relationships. We have other research clusters on global health, on digital governance, on cities and citizenship. There's a third component of what we do. In some ways, as Grace has been talking about it, in some ways it's a very precious and important component, which is the support we provide to students who might be interested in doing research in and on India and China, but understood, somewhat capaciously as global Asia too. So without further ado, I would like to start our presentations from the fellows, the student fellows, for this past year, for the year of 2020, 24-25. I'm going to introduce all of them, and they'll come one by one and make their presentations. The first presenter will be Nolan Young. He is doing his MA in International Affairs. The second will be Emily Lee, who is doing her bachelor's in fine arts in the politics communication design program at Parsons. The third will be Florian Chang, who's doing his MA in anthropology at NSSR. The fourth will be Parth Patel, who's doing his MFA in design and technology at Parsons. And our final speaker will be Aritrika Debrat, who's doing her PhD in public and urban policy at NSSR. After their presentations, we'll have a Q&A session, following which we all will hopefully convene outside for some food and further discussion. So I'm going to hand it over to Nola.
Thank you to Grace and Manjari for the introduction. My name is Nolan. I'm in the International Affairs program at NSSR. Um, and my project title is E-commerce as a Rural Development Strategy in China, the contours of a public-private partnership. Um, and like Grace said, I did go to China to do interviews and field work on this topic. And I first became interested in this topic when reading about the phenomenon of Taobao villages in China, named after the online shopping platform owned by Alibaba. Um, and these are areas whose economic activity have come to center around selling products through e-commerce platforms. Um, and the Chinese government, through a partnership with Alibaba, has directly supported the development of Taobao villages, which were touted as drivers of market access, employment, economic growth, um, which would supposedly revitalize and provide a path to poverty alleviation and broader prosperity for rural communities. Um, However, some scholars have been more critical of this development strategy, um, both for its inequitable effects on rural communities and for how it empowers an expansion of e-commerce conglomerates that lack perhaps regulation or social protections. Um, and there's this critique of Taobao villages as an example of the inequality inducing neoliberal strands of development in post-reform China. And these critiques sort of highlight their reliance on information technology to drive a rural marketization process as opposed to a development process. Um, so some of my research questions going into the project, I was primarily seeking to understand how to make sense of this as a rural development strategy, um, whether the sort of government involvement or regulation of this rural e-commerce expansion constitute a genuine developmental project, or alternatively, whether this model can be described as an outsourcing of the task of development to digital platforms. Um, I don't know, it's not even my phone. um, Alternatively, does the government exert a comparable level of control? Sorry, this is my phone. um, a comparable level of control as in other sectors of the economy. um, what are the roles of specific government institutions and officials involved in these projects? Alternatively, I wanted to better understand the challenges the model faced in the past and how these challenges might persist or change in the future, um, and to what extent this can be thought of as a model with a potential to be replicated in other developmental contexts outside of China. Um, and yeah, like I said, my research trip to China included meeting with and interviewing scholars and experts on the topic, as well as field interviews with those directly involved in rural e-commerce. My trip started in Shanghai and Nanjing, and I visited northern Jiangsu province to visit these rural e-commerce areas. Um, so like the title of my project suggests, I wanted to approach these questions both about how the development model functions as well as what it might represent through the concept of the public-private partnership, um, in this case between Alibaba and the national government. Um, and from reviewing the literature as well as my interviews throughout the summer, I gained a lot of information about what shape this public-private partnership, or PPP, takes, and what emerges is not a clear-cut division of responsibilities, and the PPP is less, it seems, a single contract, but more of a tangled ecosystem of market provision, local policy support, capacity building, and mutual legitimation between platforms and government programs. Um, Platforms deliver markets and technology, while governments deliver infrastructure, political will, and social organization. Um, Additionally, as I'll discuss a little later, there were significant variations between how this public-private partnership manifested in various parts of the country, further blurring its contours. In terms of larger theoretical considerations about PPPs, Several scholars who I read and interviewed emphasize how this strategy of rural development can be seen as part of a larger socioeconomic changes in China. Firstly, as part of a rebalancing away from export-led industrial growth towards a stronger domestic market and domestic consumption. Secondly, and relatedly, this initiative has been swept up in a rhetoric of rural revitalization, of rebalancing the stark and enduring developmental inequalities between urban and rural. Um, and then alternatively, there is a scholarly perspective which discounts the value of rural e-commerce as a significant or broad developmental vision, rather criticizing it as, or maybe not criticizing, but marking it as an instance of institutional outsourcing of the project of marketization or development. Um, However, in the context of other perspectives I encountered in my research, what I've discussed here could be considered top-down frameworks of understanding rural e-commerce. I also encountered many perspectives that challenge the idea of a national policy or a national public-private partnership, um, which largely structures how rural e-commerce is developed. Instead, there are many ways of understanding it as a bottom-up process. Um, in my interviews, there were scholars that started all the way at the bottom, emphasizing how this could be seen as an entrepreneur-led process of rural residents being the ones to take advantage of e-commerce. And once this is recognized by the county level governments as a means of raising incomes, they provide support, and eventually this filters up to national policy. Um, and this perspective sort of inherently changes how we interpret public-private partnerships between national government and digital platforms. Um, Also, those who have studied rural development in different provinces emphasize how local economies and spatial patterns of production heavily shape the types of infrastructure, financing, training, and logistics support to promote e-commerce. Um, and yeah, furthermore, different provinces have historically had significant autonomy in economic policy and planning, leading to different processes as well as different kinds of e-commerce, such as merchant or producer-based e-commerce, depending on a given region. Jiangsu province, shown here, broken down um, by prefecture development indexes, occupies a certain juncture in all of this I'm talking about that I wish I had more time to break down. But it was in northern Jiangsu province that I was able to carry out some field interviews with rural entrepreneurs, which confirmed and built upon this bottom-up perspective of this topic. And thinking back to my initial research questions I mentioned before, um, I sought out these interviews more to elucidate how their experience was shaped by developmental policy, state support, what state support looked like on a local level. And while I did get some insight into those questions, I heard a lot about these people's experience themselves, how their involvement in e-commerce stretches back before the support of national policy, um, which definitely influenced my whole perspective on the topic and the questions I was asking. Um, I see I'm running low on time, so I'm going to move on. Briefly want to touch on another thing, um, which I consider also as an alternate framework for understanding this phenomenon of e-commerce, as rural e-commerce as a developmental model. Um, Throughout my research, I was continually confronted with concrete and theoretical questions about the urban, um, despite um, despite offering the potential to partially or transcend or close spatial gaps. Digital development in China has shown to be constrained by pre-existing arrangements of production as well as distance from global cities or large centers of production or consumption, um, by distance or connection with transportation and other infrastructure. Um, and this seemed to be a key point in any comparison with other developmental contexts outside of China. Um, beyond any differences in governance or state planning or intervention, the commitment to public infrastructure, both physical and digital, in many ways makes this whole project possible. Um, so, so, in the sake of time, just to conclude, um, I hope this presentation made sense, topic made sense, and was at least a bit interesting. And I also hope I communicated sort of how my trip this summer challenged my perspective both on this topic and opened my eyes to um, not just the various perspectives and frameworks for understanding this topic in particular, um, but how to approach research generally, especially in an area that's outside of one's like intellectual comfort zone. And I attribute this to the flexibility and the ethos of exploration that the ICI fellowship allowed for. And I'm grateful that ICI is willing to provide the resources and support for me and other students to design a project with this sort of flexibility in mind. And it's something rare and I think really valuable. So yeah, I hope to carry these lessons and these various research questions forward with me in the future. And yeah, thanks again to the India-China Institute and congrats to my fellows. Thank you.
8 minutes is not enough time for all of this. Thank you, everybody, for being here. My name is Emily. It's my pleasure today to present some findings from my project, hereby titled Precarious Labor and Political Identity of South Asian Platform Workers in Hong Kong. In this presentation, I'll be aiming to provide a kind of synthesis of this paper, as well as what's important for you to know about the labor organizing activities of the South Asian platform workers in Hong Kong. So between 2014 and 2019, the number of Uber drivers in Hong Kong grew 40-fold. So it's no surprise to many of us here that platform capitalism has become a kind of global phenomena, defined here as on-demand work mediated through digital platforms. The supply side of platform capitalism can only operate at the level that they do because they are predicated on accessing a large, flexible pool of workers at any time. And because of the barriers to language, employment, encounters with racial discrimination in the formal employment system, platform work therefore becomes an accessible industry for particularly migrant workers. But since it's defined as self-employment, platform workers in Hong Kong specifically face little typical protections from both the state and the employer itself, such as insurance, minimum wage, and paid leave. The Hong Kong government, as I found out in my research, really struggles to collect official statistics on any information related to platform work, but a lot of the recent research and folks that I spoke to have actually identified that it's mostly male South Asian workers that are in this trade and are kind of the subject of my project. It is important to mention that the rise of platform capitalism kind of happened against the backdrop of the anti-extradition law amendment bill protests in Hong Kong, which at its height was almost 1 million people out on the streets in 2019. And it's also interesting that Hong Kong's unions were not really known for high membership or participation at this time. We're talking about labor organizing, but at this point, there were not that many people that were tapped in, interested in any kind of degree. But Pauline Dibbins has kind of coined this theory of social movement unionism, which is just to suggest that a lot of these traditional institutions like unions, which people kind of viewed as more bureaucratic or maybe, were only to push a certain kind of economic demand, were being used by the Hong Kong people during this time to fight beyond those kind of base level demands and more towards something that was explicitly political. And there were over 100 filings for new unions during this time. There were calls for general strikes. Many key industries in the city were able to shut down. And so you can imagine this renewed politicization of the union space during this time. Workers are publicly organizing. They're publicly engaging labor as an institution and therefore a repertoire for kind of political action. It should be said that the COVID-19 pandemic slowed down a lot of things, including this movement, mostly because social distancing requires less million-member rallies. But worldwide economies are in a slump, and there's this demand, right, that's rising for food delivery services. which South Asian workers in Hong Kong were taking the brunt of this labor. But the pandemic also shows that Hong Kong society and also globally, there was kind of this phenomenon, this racialized association of disease. And so news articles during this time will focus specifically on COVID infections in geographical areas of the city that predominantly South Asian communities are living in, or there are photos of South Asians that are congregating outside of restaurants that are going viral, right? People online are engaging in what researchers have coined kind of like a platformed racism. It's discourse that disproportionately describes platform workers as poor or bad or vectors of disease despite their essential work. And the above quote on screen is one of many racist reviews that Hong Kongers had left on food delivery apps like Deliveroo during this time. So in 2020, the kind of dwindling end of the protests was happening. The passing of the national security law had occurred, and that obviously impacted hundreds of thousands of folks in different ways. There was an impact on political demonstration, new laws, new rules, but there was also just the view of activists and lawmakers being jailed. There were large union federations in Hong Kong that represented hundreds of thousands of workers that had just altogether disbanded after the passing of this law. So a lot of researchers are calling this kind of like the post-union era of Hong Kong, right? Like there's a huge decline in public protests, there's no demonstration anymore, there's no action out of fear. So how exactly did platform workers kind of resist in these conditions? So while platform workers at leading food delivery platform Foodpanda initially kind of enjoyed these generous work packages and actual contracts that were really enticing prior to 2019, 2020 also saw kind of a tightening of the leash. We're talking about a steady decrease. First, it was hourly pay, then piece rates for some deliveries, then a lowering of those piece rates, and then some more. And in the situation of a platform worker, there's literally no boss to complain to. My research shows that the architecture of such a platform, we're talking Uber, DoorDash, all of these kinds of apps, they're deliberately designed to do that. It's the black box of opaque payment calculation and also the removal of previously available communication channels with other workers, management, real-time support. There are all these features that are designed and built in the app to basically create the terrible working conditions for platform works. And apps also therefore do the work of the boss in that way. They're collecting data on workers' speeds. They're surveilling their locations, how long they rest, how fast those deliveries are made. The labor process gets further gamified in that workers are constantly nudged by notifications to take on more orders, or maybe you even receive special bonuses during hazardous weather conditions. And this is all happening with practically no HR, no regulation, right? So in November of 2021, a Pakistani delivery driver for Foodpanda, Waqas Fida, was arbitrarily suspended from the platform. With no form of appeal, he took to a WhatsApp group with predominantly South Asian workers to just share his grievances, share some posters, and in just a week, that group chat grew to nearly 1,500 members in size. The demand was very clear, workers shared similar frustrations, and they determined that a strike was needed. So South Asian workers at this time were beginning to spread the word between their in-person networks as well. Even though there's no centralized office, and that's something that a lot of, this organizing is almost predicated on, workers actually congregate more informally while waiting for orders outside of restaurants. So it's kind of an easy way for information to flow through. And despite some linguistic barriers, there were sympathetic Chinese workers who also forwarded the calls to action on Facebook and Telegram. Maybe you were in a shared space because workers use Facebook to kind of talk about their struggles or how much they were getting paid already, but that space was being activated. And so when the strike was set for a weekend shortly after this complaint, workers were gathering in front of a physical location of Foodpanda and publicly demonstrating with signs, refusing to take orders. And one interviewee, who was a Chinese courier, actually referred to her fellow South Asian workers affectionately as older brothers because she had named her anger at the racism that they suffered in society and also considered herself almost inspired by the so-called solidarity of South Asians, which she thought was actually unique in that they had a much more stronger or united front in comparison to other Chinese platform workers during this time. And they had formed a bargaining team to meet with management at this point, but this is only something that can actually really happen also on an app in a way. the Telegram app was integral to this kind of decision-making process. In the same way that platform apps are architected to silo workers, in a way, Telegram actually afforded these striking workers easy access to large communication channels with no limit on group members, extensive polling features, and also easy translation between English and Chinese. And ultimately, workers voted on whether or not to continue striking this way or what demands that they really wanted, and it led to some successful concessions on Foodpanda's end. But what can we actually learn from the 2021 Foodpanda delivery workers strike? First, we can identify how South Asian platform workers are structurally marginalized in Hong Kong's current employment structure and they face racism at large. Second, we can identify a theory of quote unquote organized visibilization of South Asian workers, which can actually draw unique kinds of public support and attention for workers' struggles, kind of almost predicated also on the fact that they are South Asian in Hong Kong. And thirdly, despite being kind of siloed by platform architecture, workers' digital organizing can offer spaces where they can discuss their grievances, organize, and also make decisions across linguistic barriers, especially in this kind of post-union context in Hong Kong where it's hard to even gather outside at all. Ultimately, I still believe there can be no shortcuts in the struggle against platform capitalism. This is something I struggled a lot with since as Grace mentioned, I had various safety concerns ongoing in the US and Hong Kong that were making it hard to travel at all, but also many of the labor advocacy groups that I reached out to or were kind of previously the sources of information, especially the one that was involved in the Foodpanda delivery workers strike and had facilitated a lot of the actual organizing during that time. They disbanded over the summer. Most of them have kind of gone underground or just like left their current state. And in that way, I turned to other research on platform economy workers, and those guys, the ones that are doing critical work and this kind of critical research, are advocating now for workers' inquiries, which are so much more than I can get into right now. But essentially, our responsibility as researchers is to kind of co-research with our participants and organize these industries directly, right? Platform capitalism, we see it proliferating. We see it will only keep getting worse. We also see that unions and those traditional structures are not necessarily things that can save us in a context like this. And so I really believe that only the workers will lead the way out. And with that, thank you. Thank you to ICI. Y'all have been really great at supporting this research, and I really highly recommend this opportunity for everyone. It's awesome. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Florian Zhang. I'm reporting my literature study and short-term fieldwork about Chinese sojourners in Chiang Mai. Chiang Mai is a northern Thai city attracting lots of Chinese sojourners in recent years. But before going into the details about my fieldwork, I want to firstly clarify a term in my title, 桃花源. 桃花源 literally meaning the peach blossom spring, is a term originated from the name of a mysterious ideal village in 5th century Chinese poet Tao Qian's fable. Many call it the Chinese version of utopia, but unlike Thomas More, Tao never outlines a detailed blueprint. You can skim it here. Tao's more interested in portraying Tao Huayuan's intentional isolation from the outside world and histories, like villagers' famous ignorance of the dynasty changes. It's a non-place, a negation of the existing world and time. It represents more a longing for escape from the undesirable world and socio-historical temporality than a political proposal for building an ideal society. 桃花源 is such a powerful imagery in Chinese culture that it continues to be invoked frequently, including when the Chinese sojourners describe and contest Chiang Mai. They mostly went there after the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic. So why leave China? For most, because of the precarious and hyper-competitive living and working conditions in the economic decline. The intensifying political restriction is also the concern for some. Why Chiang Mai, the largest city in the northern Thailand? It is a poster at a motorbike rental store asking for reposting on Rednote or Xiaohongshu. They are good, by the way. I rent a bicycle there. You can see the ways local businesses are trying to attract Chinese customers. Chiang Mai has long been a touristic city with large English and Chinese communities, great nature and infrastructures, easy to get long-term visa. For sojourners, it's relaxing, safe, affordable, and has very nice cafe and co-working space for digital nomads. Why sojourning, or 旅居 in Chinese, in which 旅 means travel and 居 means drill. My interlocutors usually insist that they are sojourners, not tourists, 游客, or immigrants, 移民. Although some of them only stay for weeks and others may stay for years with no actual plan to leave. It should be more than sightseeing, but diving into some sort of local life, whatever it means. On the other hand, it is designed to be temporary, without commitments and free of mobility. So what kind of life they are trying to live in Chiang Mai? Here's two of my interlocutors' words. The first said, in China, it's like a ladder, and every single thing is some sort of preparation for the future. But in Chiang Mai, time seems non-existent, and I'm living, just living. He described his life as unapologetically wasting time, considering nothing about future or past. Surely there's no rushing for sightseeing sites, but it's also not an integration into the local Thai society. As he said, it's just living free of the temporality embedded in the computations and expectations in Chinese society. That is where I think the concept of 桃花源 is particularly useful. What at stake is usually not joining or building an ideal community, but an intentional separation from the previous space and temporality, a peacefulness only realized in a focus on the here and now. It also corresponds to the popular meditation practice, at least in its highly commodified form in Chiang Mai's tourism. Chiang Mai is a predominantly Buddhist city, and various meditation centers are attracting people from everywhere. Another interlocutor has practiced it for a long time. She told me, the essence of meditation is mindfulness. That is, to know what you are doing now, living in the present, never mind whatever in the future or past. No social timetable makes sense here. One may say that in these ways of living and practices, a temporary 桃花源 emerges. However, it's not to say that Chiang Mai is 桃花源. It's not. It's not isolated from world and history, but a city with specific historical, political, and economic conditions. The wave of Chinese sojourning is accompanied with the expansion of Chinese economic investments and geopolitical influence in Southeast Asia, represented by the state-initiated projects like One Belt, One Road, and many individual adventures. On the Chiang Mai streets, the Chinese chain stores prevail, and the real estate advertisements in Chinese are everywhere. The emergence of 桃花源 at least partly depends on the mobility of capitals, including Chinese ones, as well as Thailand's active strategies to develop what they called quality tourism and attract investments, in which many foreign workers from Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia are offering the exploited cheap labor. I don't have time to cover too much about it here, but it's important to keep in mind that it is this stuff that offer convenient tourism infrastructures and attractions that make possible the seek for 桃花源 and condition it. I propose to use 桃花源 as a framework that encompasses both the fantasy of the exteriority to the uneasy world and the socio-historical temporality, and the very worldly material processes that give it its shape. There's a productive tension here, an interesting challenge to locate something resisting being located while appreciating this resistance. This study also illustrates the sojourners' ambivalent relationships with China today, asking what is the relationship between the project of escape and the state's economic political ambitions. It's certainly not to conflate the sojourners as agents of the Chinese state, as some right-wing politicians would do everywhere. Rather, it's an invitation to rethink the interplay and paradoxes between the domestic condition and the global role of China today, while appreciating the individual person's experience in this process, with all its joys, hopes, disappointments, and contradictions. That's all my presentation. Thank you.
I'm gonna do a lot of speed running. It's a year-long project, so I hope not to bore you out. I'm Parth. My whole work sort of revolves around how do you involve nature in some form here and there. And what I want to discuss today and what the research is about is what happens in those mountains. So my research stemmed from this idea that I had back in 2019. I had done an internship in a remote region in Ladakh, India. And I'm going to just take you through again to the same storyline that I have been myself, nothing less, nothing more. Ladakh is mainly it's a very remote place. It's now become accessible after 1970s or 1975. It has become more touristy, but there are still very remote regions within the territory. It's still a little bit of eluded this whole idea of how people live around, and it's very different from how we live in the major cities. I was living in Karu as part of my volunteeringship in 2019. It was a small village. It was located 25 miles away from the Ladakh, from Leh Ladakh, the main city. I stayed there in a homestay and I was doing research based on my architectural studies. It was a very small village, 40 households, few cattle. A lot of people had their own backyards. They would grow their own vegetables. It's sort of a lot of communal living in the sense that people would have vegetables for the personal use, but the common farms would be plowed commonly. So there was no individual work when it comes to community. It had a very different way of looking. Like I developed a very different way and very different eye of looking at landscape. Is that you can have rough terrain in the background and yet you would still have rivers flowing in front. This whole idea of sort of doing things in rhythms of harvesting and planting and all along with how the nature functions, this sort of intrigued me a lot. But when I stayed there, I had a constant issue. At least now I think it was only me. For them, it was not that big of an issue. It was the constant energy access to electricity. So when I was started to do my research, I wanted to go back to the same place. So I reached out to the person who I was used to work in 2019, and what I got to know that the region that I was staying in didn't have the problem any longer. But he said that you should communicate the same thing to other regions because there are still very remote regions in the same territory that would eventually have the same problem. So I feel this is still sort of a top-down approach. Like I had what in terms of a problem in my mind, and I was trying to find a place where I can situate the problem. So uh, I know it's kind of a top-down approach, but I would just sort of state it before I explain the whole research. And I don't claim it as a bottom-up. Probably I've done a bottom-up way of doing it, but the problem was extremely top-down. Not something that I would recommend. So I had a chance I had a chance to talk with the village head of Turtuk. Turtuk has like comprised of 5 villages, and I was talking to the person who was the village head for Yule, and he explained this idea that they do have a problem, and the problem is very unique. I'm going to explain what's exactly that goes around with the village when it comes to electricity. Out of 5 villages, 4 villages were part of Gilgit Baltistan in India. It's like Turtuk is called the last village located at India-Pakistan border, and after that, like they have extreme close connections, and they are at the border, and you can literally see how those conflicts would take place if something has to happen. What I discovered, we talked at length about what are the lifestyle patterns of people in Turtuk and how sort of a typical day would look like, and where do they get their electricity, what are the food habits, what are the family size, so on and so forth. The main issue about the electricity was in winters a lot of the power sources within the village was relying on hydropower station. So because the temperatures would go down to minus 20 degrees Celsius, the river would freeze. That would eventually lead their hydro source to sort of completely go off. And they didn't have as such, because of the rough terrain, you don't have a main electricity line that can go throughout, because it's a very remote region in that context. So they do have it, but they have it in a very different way. So they power themselves using diesel generator, which can only last, let's say, from 6 p.m. to 11 p.m. And it is actually 6 p.m. to 11 p.m. When I stood there, like you at the moment at the clock hits 11 o'clock, the heater is off, and at minus 20 degrees, you feel the cold. I talked all about it. They would have a time of 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. in the morning and then 6 p.m. to 11 p.m. in the evening. It's like you heat your house within that moment. And the timings were sort of consciously divided amongst the villages. So they would have it alternate days. So it's not that you have full electricity on one day and then you have like 6 a.m. to 11 and 6 a.m. to 11 every alternate days. Then more about the heat, more about the architecture. How how one typical family is like they have a homestay because Turtuk is a very touristy place, so they have a different room altogether allocated for people who come to visit the place. Because in summers, in the spring season, it becomes really happening. You can see apricot, you can see the trees blooming around, so they have like that's part of their economy. One of the questions I had when I was talking about them with the electricity was that why don't you just use solar panels? So they do use a lot of solar panels, but solar panels are very expensive when it comes to scale. The governments do have the subsidies, but if they want to scale up the whole house as a power source, then solar panels would become extremely expensive for them. So this whole idea might be feasible for like a room or so, but it's not feasible if they were supposed to spend their own money doing it. What we arrived at was the one of the only sources that you can produce electricity was that you use the moderate winds in a way that you explain people this idea that there are possibilities that you can look out for alternative sources, and it's not that you have to rely about you don't have to rely on a top down approach. I think that government would do something for you and then you can get the problems out of the place. You can do it something on your own. So we said that they have a lot of scarcity of the resource. So what we can do is have a small plug and play electricity kit where I developed enough prototypes to say that okay, what kind of how would we make a turbine if we were supposed to make one? Because you have to consider about the region's locality, region's availability of the material. So I said that okay, I'll develop a manual, kind of like a very step-by-step Lego piece for you to look at it, and then did the studies, did a lot of physical work before going to the place. So like a small wind chamber, small 3D printed prototypes, ran all of them in the same conditions to figure out which one would work the best. And then I hit an abrupt end to it because the person who I was talking to didn't respond to the feedback that I wanted to have. Like I wanted to have feedback on what kind of prototype looks doable to you. So that the person Anayatullah sort of just we had an abrupt ending to the conversation. So I could luckily find another person, Gulam Mehndi, who was a district councillor, and he helped me throughout the process after that point. I went back to India to run a demo rehearsal kind of a version because they were very clear that the kind of form you're talking about, you can do it, but we don't know if you can make it or not. So you have to do it in a way that we have some trust that you can pull it off. So I did like a whole thing that if I were to make something by scrap, how would I make it? Then I talked to two fabricators who sort of helped me throughout the process, then like took my sketches to further and then developed it on a one-to-one scale. I got the framework done. Then I was thinking about how do you sort of make this thing go on to the next step. My mother taught me how to weave, like because my designer brain sort of couldn't figure it out. How do you do a DIY weaving? Then I had to put cloth on it because the wind would otherwise go by, and you need like a strong blockage to that. I eventually did sort of manage to pull it off, to do a 1:1 prototype, and I was a little confident that okay, at least the prototype would not be a fiasco. I took a field trip. This was my 14-day trip at Turtuk. And before you go to Turtuk, you see the lot of landscape and you see how the landscape changes from the mountains, harsh mountains. There's a very typical image of how a typical village looks like. So you have rough terrains around and you have like a small village located right in the center. And you have a river flowing through the mountains. This is a place where I stayed. It's a homestay. It was the homestay of the village head, Karim Bahadur. I talked to him and I explained him in detail, sat with him, sort of did the sketches and explained them what kind of materials and skill set we require. He sort of then directed me to Inayat. Inayat is the person who's doing the messy stuff with me. He sort of understood my sketchiness of the idea. Then he said that you no longer have to worry about how you can pull it off. I will just take it from here. So from that point onwards, it was all Inayat's design. A key insight, when we made the frame structure, I told Inayat that I made a lot of mistakes, and Inayat said that that's okay. You have done a lot of unnecessary things, and if I were to make it, I would make it much better. And I think at that point, I thought of okay, yeah, this is something that I wanted to do. That I didn't want to give a solution, but sort of more of an iterative process that you build it up from this point. This is not a final product. This is not a solution that I'm here to give you because I cannot. I did the same thing again, but this time I had much better idea of how to do it. Once it was done, they had a little more confidence. Before that, I was still an outsider. At this point, they were like, okay, something is rotating on its own, means what he's doing makes some sort of sense. Then they said that they had a lot of discussion where you should put it in, and the village had said that you should put it on the top of the mountain. And when they said you should put on the top of the mountain, I didn't know they literally meant putting it up on the mountain. So it was like a 4-hour trek that we did, and they chose a mosque that is on top of the hill and said that we did an assembly together. They did a lot of improvisations to my ideas, and then we sort of had eventually a prototype that worked for a bit. They, I'll tell you about it. We had a lot of conversations about how we can take this thing further. With them, they had a lot of questions, and at the end of the day, what I realized, my research is more well put if we ask that it was a shift from me asking a lot of questions and pestering their brain, and then eventually them in return starting to ask a lot of questions. I always believe that it's not possible to pull this thing alone, and I was immensely grateful for the institute's support because it was a lot of back and forth process. It was a little tedious, but it was possible because it was a thorough support in all senses. You can run through the graphic novel and the documentary because this was a legit speed run. This would give you more explained version of the story. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Well, Part took us to the north of the country. I'm going to take you to the east of the country, a place called Sundarbans near my home, Shundarbon in my own language. It's a place that has shaped my research interest, my memories, my idea of disaster and resilience, and also because as a Bengali in India, it's a national duty to work in Sundarbans. The summer that just went by, the last summer, I was supposed to go there in person, but I could not end up due to some personal immigration issues. So what I did was stuck to my research questions, my research aim, and I made use of all the secondary and tertiary resources that I had in hand and tried to understand the resettlement and the relocation patterns post-disaster in Sundarbans. So geographically spacing that, it is in the northern boundary of Bay of Bengal. It is the world's largest mangrove forest shared between India and Bangladesh. It's home to extraordinary biodiversity. It's a World UNESCO Heritage Site. Sorry. It's home to it's home to the flora and fauna, the Royal Bengal tiger, the alligators, the deers, and the different birds species that you can see. But it's also about the human life that is entangled with the mangrove vegetation, rivers, deltas, and fragile soil. Occupations in Sundarbans, it's also a very common sight. Tourist and boat in search of the tigers. Occupations in Sundarbans are mostly climate sensitive, very much environment dependent, fishing, shrimp, farming, honey collection, betel leaf plantation. One of my entry points to Sundarbans as a research realm is the tropical cyclones. It is a place of constant rupture. multiple cyclones, recurring floods, and the slow but certain rise, definitely certain but definitely noticeable as well, the sea level rise are pushing people out of their homes. Every storm means broken roofs, lost crops, drowned livestock. Every return home after the disaster, after the relocation, they come back home, they rebuild the home from scratch and then start waiting for another disaster, anticipating another disaster. This is the perpetual cycle. All this data and the figures can be debated, challenged. Okay, that's okay. Debated, challenged, and can be confusing because there are so many figures and not everything is reliable. But what cannot be denied is the frequency of the disasters, the impact of the disasters, which has been validated across multiple sources. For example, what my focus was, Amphan in May 2020, right when India was under partial lockdown due to COVID-19. The overlap made the disaster increasingly difficult. Relief operations were delayed, mobility was restricted, and the vulnerable people, vulnerable households had to cope with both a global pandemic and a devastating cyclone at the same time. Sundarbans is also a place that is incredibly rich in cultural heritage, folklore, rituals, songs, deities, and in their own spiritual practices. But what drew me most was the art of Potachitra, which is a scroll, which is scroll paintings. So what the scroll paintings would mean to me, I imagined it as a very unique storytelling device. They would use it mostly for mythological ways, mythological evidences. But what I realized, if I carry a scroll, instead of interviewing in the villages that I go, I can ask people to add their drawings, experiences, words, expressions in that scroll, and it can become a collective memory space. And based on one disaster or a relocation experience that they have been through. So to bring this idea to light, I focused on one night, which is Cyclone Amphan in May 2020. I talked with some women over telecommunications. I talked with field coordinators. And together, these fragments created a mosaic of memory to create an archive of disaster-related resettlement and also archive at the same time. So I will bring like 6 snippets of conversations to you. The first one, a woman called Savitri remembers how 500 people from their community were packed into 2 rooms and 1 toilet. That is the block development office, which is the rural panchayat office. Rural government office in their village, and the children actually enjoyed that night because there were so many people packed into that small area. It was a very sturdy place that protected them for that night. The next one is of Gauri, who is older than the rest of the responders today, and she had no one. She had 3 cows, 1 house, 1 storage shed, and 1 cow shed. And she came to know about this cyclone shelter plan much later. But she could not neglect her family, which is the 3 cows. And she took the cows even at the last moment to the relocation center. Jhumpa, the other woman who remembered, she couldn't go to the relocation center because her mother-in-law was ill, but who came to help was another woman from the neighborhood with medicines and food to survive that night. And she was really glad, of course. Geeta remembers how she was really glad that her husband could secure a very strong shop in the village marketplace the last year because that was their refuge for that night. They came back home the next day. She remembers that her children also got 3 more children from the village so that no one is left behind. Another old woman, she did not speak about that night specifically, the Amphan night, but the next day she remembers a Muslim political local leader used a Hindu religious precinct place to distribute bamboo poles, quills, medicines, foods, and that stayed back with her. The last one, this was mother and daughter, I would say, not in-laws added. They remember how a prayer hall in a school building was adapted a 3-night refuge for them. It was broken into sectors for women, men, children, cattle, chickens. And yeah, they drew that picture mentally and I tried to sketch it out. So all these brings me to my own Potachitra, my own scroll painting, the 6 interwoven narratives which collectively trace an ecology of care, space, and interdependence, shedding light on how people mobilize networks, social capitals, relationships, resources during the crisis. So if we look closely to realize how the resettlement or short-term relocation looks in cyclone-affected regions of Sundarban, in my example, that night the women did not end up in some hospital or where state-built refuges are designed based on the number of beds and number of toilets and distributed according to the number of population. But the refuge was reshaped in forms of different levels of infrastructure, emotional, intangible social networks, mixed built infrastructures, markets, schools, shops, homes, and temples that turned into places of survivals. So in my understanding, I realized that is everyday humanitarianism. These are the shelters that are adapted, they are improved, they're distributed and fluid. They show us that humanitarian actions need not be just about external aid, but about collective everyday practices that are embedded every day. I have multiple learnings, but when I was talking with these people, the narrative was never sad. It was one of determination and agency. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you to all our speakers for these truly, truly wonderful presentations. I think the kind of spirit of inquiry, adventure, and creativity that's represented in your projects is really impressive. Let me start maybe with a question for the last two speakers, Aritrika and Parth. When both of you did your work in what are ecologically very fragile and remote parts of the country, and maybe it was just your project, but to me it was striking that the state seems remarkably absent in your stories. Now, is that just because you chose not to look at the state and the infrastructure it provides, whether it be for disaster relief or power generation and distribution, or was it genuinely missing from these kind of peripheral regions?
The state was not really missing, but yes, they were missing because they know everything was socially negotiated, even if they wouldn't intervene. The relocation programs, the relocation plans at the last moment comes as announcements from the state, comes as announcement from the block divisions. But people have that that confidence that they can be better and they can also socially negotiate and design among themselves. So it was not a coincidence, maybe, but yeah, that's we.
I didn't look at it. I didn't focus about state at all because for a couple of reasons. One, when I did a 2019 internship at that time, also it was a lot about volunteering ideologies in the sense that people would do things on their own. So they required little to less support from the outside. So even when I talked about electricity to them, when I went there and did whole of the research, for them it was never a problem. I did ask them if at all the terrain is so difficult and you have a lot of other, let's say, financial issues, then sort of what's the harm in moving out of the village? And then they said that the landscape is all we know. We know people 11 villages next to us and 11 villages back to us. So we would never leave the landscape. And whatever they have developed there, I think they've developed on their own. So they've been doing and passing the same indigenous knowledge from generations to generations. So you still see a lot of a lot of bottom up things there, and also not of a state interferences because they think state in terms of military. They have a lot of military presence at the borders. For them, it's like always a distinct idea. It's not like how we can take up our problems and then let's say we should held accountable whoever is the collective district or whoever is on the state position. For them, it's less of that. It's more people coming together and doing things on a sarpanch level or somebody who takes up a responsibility and figures out rest of the things. So
I think both of you are great sketchers. Oh my gosh, right? Definitely it's for publication, but at the same time, your device, I'm really out of it. I thought that would be helpful during the summertime. How is it helping them with the heat? How's the heat in this journey?
So the whole idea about doing that turbine was to first figure out whether they can make it or not. So if these kind of questions were the ones, if I were supposed to stay there for a little bit of longer period of time, I could figure out about it more. So let's say about the particular heat issue, turbine would not be a good solution for that, because then you would use a different material to solve the particular issue. So you would rather use wool that they get from the sheep, and then you sort of clad the house walls using wools, and then that would help the heat to trap in, but not the turbine. Turbine was more to sort of give them the basic version of a light, because outside in the winters the sun would sort of set a little early, and the timeline wouldn't match. So the 6 p.m. to 11 p.m. work would not match for them. They would want to have like a light a little later in the day or a little early in the day. So my idea was to sort of first address that, and then pick up from that point onwards.
ICE unlawfully detaining a lot of Uber drivers, DoorDash drivers, and Uber not taking accountability for it. I think I want to know if these platforms that you talked about in China have been able to take any sort of accountability after racist comments, the ones that you mentioned, came to light. And usually, when in mainstream media something like that comes forward, huge corporations, MNCs around the world, they tend to at least pass a statement or like give press releases and stuff like that. Were you able to see that in China to any level, to any extent?
This is a really interesting question. I can speak more specifically to that comment, which was pulled from this researcher who was collecting specific information on like Chinese language materials that are to do with like the kind of disproportionate way that you're talking about South Asians. So that comment specifically, that review specifically, there was a point where once it had kind of broken into the English news bubble, obviously Deliveroo and Food Panda, it's like the most bare minimum thing that they could say is that they were just screening those comments more effectively, or they said something like, oh, we're going to institute something that'll, help screen out these like racist attitudes. But it's just hard because it's like with platform work, racism is like fundamental to how that structure thrives, and is also precisely the kind of reason why a lot of people choose that work, because it's almost like in some ways it's the easiest way to do the job and get the money without needing to necessarily like subject yourself to what might even, like, some people I spoke to thought about like whether or not it was actually better, or like it's a beggar's choice to choose food delivery work in a way for a lot of people in Hong Kong. But at the same time, that beggar's choice also comes with almost this understanding that you're not going to be interfacing with people as much as you would, and like struggling upwards and like kind of like fake social mobility in Hong Kong society. In China, I did do a little bit of research on it, but it's actually, like, to my understanding, like those apps like Meituan or whatever are still not, like, there wasn't much research on specifically like migrants like using those apps or forming the workforce for those. I'd be interested if other people like know differently, but in Hong Kong specifically, it's interesting. Yeah.
So my question is also to Emily, because we know that your focus is on like platform labor. Most of them are migrant labor. So because my question is more about your kind of observation when it comes with migrant labor in general, because I know there are a lot of migrant labor from Southeast Asia who are doing domestic work in a lot of Hong Kong families, and many of them are women. And we also know there's abuse issues there. And I've also heard stories about how they try to fight back, like how they try to come together to fight for their labor rights. So I wonder if you see any overlapping between these groups, especially I'm very curious about the gender dynamic there.
That's like a really good question. Yeah, most of the people that are interviewed for the studies that like I was able to do, and also just in general that have been conducted so far in that issue in Hong Kong, they're all men. Like most of them are. There has been a little bit more work recently to do with like platform care workers, like the same way in the U.S. you have like home care workers that are kind of like it's mediated through a platform as well. There's starting to be things like that in Hong Kong where you do see more women that are present there, but the overlap is kind of not always there. In some ways, like to me, I like that's why I thought it was interesting to investigate it like with the dynamic of like the 2019 protests and like this social movement unionism vibe. It just applies to anybody who's like, oh, I'm a worker, like I can, politically demonstrate. And so during that time there were, you know, domestic workers, migrant workers who were women who were standing in support and who also at that time felt a heightened sense of like solidarity with Hong Kong nationalism in a way, like the kind of like it's described as localism, but also it like at that time it was just like folks who were pro democracy against Beijing, against this idea of kind of like mainland Chineseness were in themselves Hong Kongers. So they kind of create like this new identity that's also rooted in a little bit of like a political understanding. And also it's like a little bit broader than just like, oh, I speak Cantonese or like culturally I connect more. Like it could be that, you were a migrant worker and you would still kind of identify with this cause in a way because you've like lived your life in Hong Kong. And so those were kind of places where people, I think across the board, like even with the platform workers that were interviewed, they were able to also kind of like find like a connection there. But I think I don't know. I think it's also maybe to do with like the kind of different NGOs that are helping in different ways or like how they connect with each other. It used to be that there was more kind of like women's NGOs that were connected that were doing a lot of that like organizing of like migrant domestic workers versus like this one Christian NGO that was like all about labor organizing in Hong Kong. Those were the guys that were doing most of the work with platform workers who are like mostly men. So it's interesting to see those networks. I don't think I have like a clear vision, but I definitely see like the gendered labor there is like just a fascinating kind of difference.
Yeah.
Hi, my question is directed to Aratrika. I really appreciated how your research covered the damage that floods caused in the Sundarbans. I think it's a very pressing issue in South Asia, Southeast Asia. Do you think that there's a lot of preventive measures that's happening? Are these communities changing the way that they usually construct their architecture when rebuilding their houses? Is this disrupting their initial ways of living?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So that is where, so 2 years before when I applied for this PhD program, I kind of was interested how resettlement designs are happening more on the architectural built environment side. And then I gradually moved and evolved to climate migration. And those who know me, I blabber about climate migration all the time. So that is where my delineation of research question was, because rebuilding their houses was a very important part. But yes, rebuilding how many times? So they are planning accordingly. People are being moved out, pushed out of their homes. So they are planning more for further like education, further saving up for health resources when they move out. So their preparedness has changed. It's more, not, I won't say less, but there is a right to remain, right to stay and adapt at the place, but also at the same time, right to move. And hence, a refocus is needed in that sense. And when we are talking about climate change mitigative issues or adaptive issues versus climate mobility issues, a lot of terminologies and the way we see it, it changes. So that is where things are changing, I would say. They already have architectural revolutions in the way they now see or use the materials that they were building a few years ago. But the planning for the future, the aspirations and the hopes from the future is changing. And that's not only just built environment, that is more in the bank accounts and livelihood transitions sector, if I understood your question correctly. Thank you.
Just a question that I'm going to pose to all the panelists, and you can think about it um, before answering, and which is, we're in this kind of strange time where there are all sorts of hurdles to travel around visa, immigration. There are concerns about states having surveillance apparatus, social media related surveillance apparatus. So, do you have tips or methodological or practical advice for future grantees who might be traveling to China or India or studying that region that you would like to impart to future grantees? So
Yeah,
just
I, on the one hand, feel like lucky and privileged that as a US citizen this summer I was able to travel without the same sort of anxieties that um, a lot of people at the new school and um, in the US have had to deal with. Um, but yeah, I had also, you know, it was my first time visiting China, and there's a lot of things I had to feel out. But in terms of advice to other people, um, I don't know. I think I also got lucky with the networks the networks of other people I was able to tap into. I think, you know, scholars that I just reached out to and were really generous about um, putting me onto their networks, and other people that um, were just really compassionate and excited that you're interested in the things that they're interested in. And yeah, I think that there's um, a lot of power in like shared curiosity about things, and people, if you meet the right people, will um, yeah, really help you out. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of like the annoying question, because all the stuff I like and I'm interested in happens to be like like I feel like there's a like this is definitely stuff that my mom has been a researcher for a while in Hong Kong. I think she gave me that bug too, but she does traditional Chinese medicine, which is entirely different than like the kind of political aspect of the things that I like. Um, so I don't know, I've been feeling pretty disillusioned about it recently. I take a lot of measures like personally, and when I was engaging in this project, like most of the organizers I know in Hong Kong already are on forms of like proton mail and more encrypted kind of ways of communication, but it doesn't mean that those things are still terrifying for people that are participating in it, and also different in some ways. But also sometimes technology can be kind of simple and dumb in the way that the way that surveillance is happening now in the US and all the different things they're doing. I could talk at length about that. And also, if you haven't already, it's a good time to opt out of facial recognition at at airports, which is like, you're right, even if they're gonna give you a hard time about it. But even beyond that, it's like some parts of like what it means to do this research, I think fundamentally involves an element of like just being subject to an eye that you don't really know how far reaching it goes, but it also shouldn't stop us in some ways from delivering like the critical scholarship that we need like to be honest, if they did something to students during like who were embarking on this trip of scholarship, right, and like asking questions that needed to be asked, there's a part of me that's got to think like you're probably doing something right, because you're poking at something that folks don't want you to gain more information on. And we are in a privileged position. There is a difference between me coming here, um, like as an international student and having the means to be here in the United States for the past 4 or 5 years versus folks who, like we were talking about, bottom up or like top down kind of views of research. And for me, I'm almost like this is the way to like level the playing field.
I feel I'm not the best person to talk about it because I went to Thailand this summer. Which, I don't know. Yeah, and it's basically much more free to go than like China or maybe India. And I am a Chinese citizen, and but I left the United States this summer, but not because of any skills or endurance, but more like just an attitude of whatever things happen without. And I'm lucky that nothing really happens in my time outside of the United States, and I got re-entry rather smoothly. And for people who may want to conduct research in China. I went back to China in this summer as well, and of course, in terms of visa, as I'm a citizen there, so it's not a problem for me. But if people like from other countries want to conduct research in China, there's maybe a lot of tips you need to keep in mind, like prepare the VPN in advance, and to keep an eye on your like visa policy and everything, and also when you want to touch some topics with some sort of political sensitivity, which is almost everything in China today. Please be very careful, and if if you do not use like safe enough venue to talk about it with people, it might get trouble to you maybe, and also to the people you talk with. And if you are not very sure, just talk about the safety concern very bluntly with your interlocutors who might know about it and who might get a way to like avoid some sort of issues. Yeah, that is.
Okay. I don't want to sound scary, but I think it's don't take it with a pinch of salt, because my research sort of had a certain technology component to it, and that has landed me not in troubles, but I was screened at all the airports because it was a remote region and I could not build, like you could not expect to have a certain electric component with them. So my bags were full of all kinds of turbine kits and alternating motors and everything. So like I always had a big cross on all of my suitcases saying that what are you putting it in. So just for on the safer side, as long as you have an explanation and you understand what those things are for, and it otherwise everything would sort of look a bit of surprise here and there, because they would ask you questions from all the angles saying that why is this component in particular of the need. And also a little bit one more added on layer was where I was doing the research, it was already a very military sensitive area. So that was like an added on problem for us, that you have to explain them that why are you there. And I was even trouble. I didn't have a permit to stay in the village, which only got to realize once I was at the village, that they said that you can't go in because you don't have a permit. And they would screen you for 2 to 3 hours saying that why are you here, which school you are part of, and they would ask you every possible thing. So I hope it's particularly relevant to my research and nobody has to go through all of this, but just in case, to prepare for these surprises and not to taken off by them is kind of important, and that's the only advice I have. Because if you're doing something with technology and doing it a very remote area that has a lot of sensitive nature to it, then you sort of be prepared with the explanations, because they do come at from all the perspectives. Yeah.
I did not travel, so I won't be the best person to answer. But I just have no tips, just something to share. The first thing is be safe, and you are the best judge of your immigration situation. So even if it is the same visa, we are in different levels and different situations first. And secondly, I remember, I think the last slide or the last but one slide of Parth, that you need a village to address the passionate question you have. So keep contacts, keep increasing contacts, and keep in touch with those contacts. They will help you through. So even if you're not in the field, they are those poles and nodes of your research. So fieldwork can also be done there. Thank you.
Join me again in congratulating